Hello, scholars. Welcome back. This is lecture 3. We're going to discover or talk about chapter 3, the biological basis of behavior. We're going to begin with the idea of the basic unit of the neuron. Talk about how the neuron is really essential in how our body communicates with our central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, our thoughts, our actions, just how we're able to function as human beings. And the neuron and other neuron and neurological cells in our body communicate with one another. We'll talk about the different basic components of the neuron. We'll talk about how the neuron functions through releasing different chemicals called neurotransmitters. And then in the second part of this lecture, we'll begin to talk about the brain and then how the brain functions and the different functions of the brain. And we'll move into different areas that are associated with, how we identify the different research that's done to identify what functions of the brain are in different areas of the brain that have and exhibit to different purposes. Okay, so we'll talk about that, and then as we talked about chapter 4, sensation and perception, one of my favorite chapters to teach. We'll begin on chapter 4, and then we'll move right along. So I hope you're having a great day. Let's set my timer, and then we'll get started. All right. So, biological basis of behavior. Communication in the nervous system. So we're going to talk about extensively how there's communication within the nervous system. We talk about the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, and we'll talk about how that happens. Okay. All right. So nervous tissue. All right. So they're in our body. Again, when we talk about the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, we'll talk about that a little later. But that is what contains, and it contains everything that we know, the neurons and the cells in our body that send, receive, and integrate and transmit information from one piece, the neuron, to the next neuron. Okay. So again, the cells in the nervous system fall into two different categories. You have the neurons and you have glia cells. Neurons in our body, we have different types of cells. We have muscular cells, we have brain cells, we have all types of cells in our body, and those cells communicate together. And neurons are what help the cells communicate. Okay, the neuron is an individual cell in the nervous system. And again, it is responsible for receiving information, integrating information, and transmitting information from, again, neurons to neurons. We have sensory neurons, motor neurons, and we call interneurons, which are those neurons that connect. They connect the sensory, motor, and other neurons together to form a network, or a really complex chain of networks that assist in communication. Okay, there are different. The neuron has different components. So one of the major components of the neuron is the soma, which is the cell body. And that cell body contains the nucleus and much of all the other components that really make up the neuron and help it to function properly. And so that's what really important. The nucleus is that the center, right? The machinery that helps the neuron function. Then you have what we call the dendrites. And the dendrites are kind of those branch-like structures of the neuron that specialize to receive information from other neurons. And I'll show you a diagram in the next couple of slides that shows you the different components and how they are associated and look together. And then you have the axon. The axon is a long, thin fiber that transmits signals away from the soma. So you have the dendrites, which receive information from into the neuron, and then you have the axon, which sends information away. I like to look at the axon as like an extension cord, and so it's sending information away from the soma to other neurons, muscles, or glands. Okay. Another parts of the neuron, you have what we call the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is kind of an insulation around the axon. So it covers and wraps around the axon, and it creates conductivity, right? So the more myelin sheath, the thicker the myelin sheath is around the axon, the faster the axon is able to, or the neuron is able to send messages back and forth from other neurons. Okay, go again. So the encasing, the insulation is really, really important. When that insulation is deteriorated, when it is damaged in any way, that's when you start to see different disorders, specifically multiple sclerosis, the disease of multiple sclerosis. That is specifically an attack on the myelin sheath that leaves the nerve exposed. And when the nerve is exposed, then you start to have all types of skeletal and brain dysfunctions, right? And so you want a really, really healthy neuron, and the axons need to be covered in that myelin sheath, which helps to protect from signals and nerves being exposed to the outside environment. Then you have what we call a terminal button, and the terminal button sits at the end of the dendrites. Okay, small knobs at the end of the axons, excuse me, and they secrete chemicals called neurotransmitters, like we talked about. Okay, so again, those small knobs, they have neurotransmitters sitting in them, being stored at the ends of the terminal buttons, and then once when we talk about the energy being passed, the energy is sending chemical signals from one neuron to the next through the terminal button, and it's doing it across what we call a synapse, or what we call a synaptic cleft, a junction where information is transmitted from one neuron to the next. And so those neurotransmitters are being transmitted across the synapse, which is a really, really microscopic small space that is connected from one neuron to the next. Okay. One of the other, again, major parts of the cell, two major common cells, the glia cells. Glia cells, they're found throughout the entire nervous system, and they are kind of like Robin to Batman. They help provide support for neurons, but in and of themselves, they are extremely talented. They do a lot of work outside of just helping and supporting the neurons. They also can send and receive chemical signals as well. But they supply nourishment. They help remove neurons, waste products, whatever waste is coming out of the neurons. The glia cells is able to clean that up, to provide a really clean environment for the neurons. Provides insulation around many of the axons on top of the myelin sheath. And again, like we talked about, receive, and they can also send signals as a cell. Cells can receive and send signals as well. And, they may also play a really big role in a variety of major disorders. And when we talk about psychology, we're talking about the combination of physiology and philosophy. And physiology, the body is such a dynamic and really complex organism. And so a lot of what we know has been studied for centuries. And we're still studying some of these functions now because, again, we're all unique in the way our body functions. We have some really common functions that happen in our body. But the disorders that we see, again, they're very unique and they maybe exhibit themselves very differently in different individuals. And so we're studying and having to study what particular roles a lot of the, we have so many neurons in our body, which we'll talk about. We have neurotransmitters we have almost at least 100, as we'll see. So it's really important that we study, and do the research so that we get a good idea of what's happening in our bodies. Okay. So how do we send information? How do we use the energy in our body to send information? We are electrical beings, and what happens in our body when we're sending an electrical pulse through neurons are sending electrical chemical messages to other neurons in our body. So if our brain is telling our hand, right now I'm telling my hand to open and close, my brain is sending a chemical message, a electrochemical message from my brain to my hand, telling it to open and close, right? And so how does that happen? It's a process what we call the neural impulse. And this neural impulse is that signal that moves through the neuron when a neuron is stimulated. right? So it moves from the cell body. That's where the information is, kind of originated, and then it sends it through the axon, down the axon, and then sends it through those terminal buttons into another axon. Okay, through the dendrites into another axon, right? Or into another neuron, right? So that's how again we communicate from one neuron to the next. So inside and outside of the neuron are fluids, right, that contain electrically charged ions and atoms, um, and well, atoms and molecules. And these atoms and molecules are called ions. Okay, so we have several different ions that are flowing inside and out of the neuron, and that's kind of the chemical environment that the neurons are in. Okay, so you have sodium ions, you have potassium ions, which are positively charged, and then you have a chlorine ion, which is negatively charged, and they flow across the cell membrane at different rates to either keep the cell membrane, what we call it, a resting potential. And the resting potential is when there is there's like balance, right? You have more negatively charged ions inside inside the neuron than you have on the outside. And then when there's information that's wanting to be passed, then there is a rush of positive ions that um, enter into the neuron to fire what we call an action potential, right? But the resting potential of a neuron is stable, really, really stable. And that's when the neuron is at rest. And it's a negative charge when the cell is really, really inactive, right? And that is around negative 70 millivolts, right? So again, it's a negatively charged particle at that point. As particles then begin to rush in, as we see in diagram B, we start to see that there is let me get my pointer. So we start to see that when there is a change from the outside into, right, there are negatively charged ions leaving or coming to the outside, and there's positively charged ions going into the neuron. Then we start to see some activity in the neuron, and the polarization begins to change, right? So it goes from negative 70 millivolts, it increases to negative 50. And at negative 50, those positive ions are going into the cell. Those not, the sodium and the potassium are going into the cell. It reaches a negative 50 millivolts, and then that's when it fires what we call an action potential. That action potential is that neural impulse that then sends that signal down, and you have different action potentials that are moving across and down the axon. Okay. After that fires, that neural impulse then it gets back to a point of rest, and then we have what we call a refractory period. The refractory period actually dips a little bit below negative 70 millivolts, and then a couple milliseconds later, and then it returns back to its resting state, resting potential. Okay. Again, that action potential is that peak where that neural impulse fires, and it's a brief neural electrical charge that travels along the axon until it sends that signal all the way to another neuron. Okay, the channels in the cell membrane are responsible for that because they're allowing and open to let sodium in, and then after they close, after that action potential has left, then it returns. The polarity returns back to the negative. The inside of the cell becomes negative again, and then it's back at its resting potential. Okay. The refractory period is that really, really small, a small amount of time that the ion or the neuron cannot fire. Right. So it's a minimum length of time that it cannot fire. Right. It's shut down for a time. Right. The neural impulse, again, is an all or nothing response. Like again, it's like firing of an action potential. Right. It's once you fire it, you can't take it back, right? Once it hits that negative 50 millivolts and it fires, you can't barely fire action potential. It's going to fire at essentially the same strength each time, and then it'll have the refractory period, and then you'll see as it moves down from neuron to neuron. Okay. Again, the neuron does convey information, and it conveys it based on kind of the varying rates at which they fire action potential. So each neuron doesn't fire at the same rate. Right? Some action potentials fire at a slower rate, some fire at a faster rate. It really just depends on the neuron and what information is being sent from neuron to neuron. Okay. So what happens at the terminal button, right? So what we're looking at right now is this is the terminal button. It looks like a little button, right? And so this is the axon. It's sending information from the neuron, the soma. This is the axon, this is the myelin sheath, the clear part around the blue. And these are the axons branches off, and these are the terminal buttons, right? So this terminal button, this is what we call the presynaptic neuron. This is the cell that is sending information across what we call the synaptic cleft. The synaptic cleft, as you can tell, right, it looks like from further away, it looks like that the cells are connected and they're touching, but they're not actually touching. There is a microscopic space, right, or gap between the terminal button on the top neuron and the cell membrane of the other neuron. This is the cell membrane of the other neuron, right? And so it's really, really important. And these are the dendrites, right? It's linking into the dendrites, and some of them are actually linking directly into the cell body, okay? The soma, right? So information, these red dots are what we call neurotransmitters, and we'll talk about those here shortly. But again, this is really, really important as we talk about how information is being transmitted. So you have neurotransmitters that are being stored in these terminal buttons. And as these information is as the action potential is sending that pulse, then it begins to release these neurotransmitters out into the synaptic cleft. Okay, you have again a presynaptic neuron, which is the information, the neuron that's sending information away, and then you have the postsynaptic neuron, which is receiving the signal, and you have receptor sites they kind of fit like a key. So each neurotransmitter has a specific receptor site that it connects to. So we talk about acetylcholine, dopamine, or serotonin, norepinephrine. All of these have very specific receptor sites, and these receptor sites they bind together like a key. No other receptor site and neurotransmitter can bind to any other receptor site. They have to be one to one. Okay. The information that's being sent is then what we consider what we call a postsynaptic potential. And the postsynaptic potential is, again, with this membrane, this neuron that's receiving information, that is what we have, that voltage and the change at the receptor site, right? That is the energy that's being sent. Okay, and then that energy is being sent and then it then passes off into what we know as another action potential that then fires to another neuron. Okay, they do not actually operate as an all or nothing law as action potentials do, right? They're kind of on a spectrum. Okay, it's kind of in a spectrum in how they fire and the voltage and how it changes. Okay, but again, you have the synthesis is happening, right? This is storage of the neurotransmitters, and once this is being released, it comes out into the synaptic cleft, the release into the synaptic cleft, and then you have the binding, right? You have the binding of the neurotransmitters from the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron, and then it's absorbed into the postsynaptic membrane, as we see here. Anything that is not used, any uh, neurotransmitter that's not used, we'll talk about it. There's a process in which it's what we call reabsorbed or sponged up, and a process called reuptake, and there are several others, right? There's an activation by enzymes that help them to kind of absorb it and break down the neurotransmitters, and then everything else is kind of diffused in a process we'll talk about diffusion, okay? So when we receive signals in the postsynaptic potential, you have what we call an excitatory PSP and you have an inhibitory PSP. And the neurotransmitters, they are either excitatory or inhibitory, okay? And we'll talk about several different neurotransmitters and their function and how they create a positive voltage shift or a negative voltage shift, okay? But an excitatory PSP is a positive voltage shift, and it increases the likelihood that the postsynaptic neuron will fire another action potential, right? When we have an inhibitory PSP, that reduces or decreases the likelihood that the postsynaptic neuron will fire an action potential, right? So it really depends on what neurotransmitter is being, again, transmitted across the synaptic cleft. If the neurotransmitter is inhibitory, then that decreases the likelihood and it slows down the rate of firing for action potentials. And if the neurotransmitter is excitatory, which we'll learn, then it increases the likelihood and it speeds up the process. When we talk about excitatory, it increases the likelihood that there will be an action potential that is fired. Okay. So again, there are effects of them. It lasts only a fraction of the time. So if one neurotransmitter is inhibitory, and it kind of stops the other neuron from firing, and then after that, another excitatory neurotransmitter is transmitted, then that action potential will go ahead and fire, right? Again, like we talked about before, if we go back up, so we have these neurotransmitters. Not all of these neurotransmitters, these red dots, get absorbed into or bind to the neurotransmitters at the receptor sites, right? So what happens when that does not happen? Right, we have number 4 and we have number 5 that occur. We have reuptake and we have what we call an inactivation by enzymes or a removal, a drifting away of neurotransmitters. And again, most neurotransmitters are reabsorbed through that process of reuptake, right? But in the process that does not happen, again, most of them don't. The other neurotransmitters are then dissolved through a process called diffusion. That means they're kind of they fade away. They kind of drift away and fade away. And then you have others that are broken down by enzymes through a process called degradation. And all of these different processes removes all the unused neurotransmitters that aren't binded to receptor sites at the postsynaptic neuron. Okay. So again, what really happens is there is a balance in what we call excitatory signals and inhibitory signals. So neurotransmitters are being sent across the post and the presynaptic or the postsynaptic neuron across that synaptic cleft. And these neurons have to receive signals from thousands and thousands of other neurons. And so in order to function at an optimal level, there has to be a balance in the inhibitory and the excitatory neurons in our body, right? So we must integrate the excitatory and the inhibitory signals before it decides whether it's going to fire a neural impulse in that action potential, right? Most neurons are interlinked, right? So if you look at the image at the left here, you see the interlinking of all of the different neurons, right? We have the soma, you have the axon, and you have the myelin sheath, and then they're all kind of interconnected in this complex chain, circuit, and network. And they work together to submit or transmit information. This is the brain. You see the different, the brain is lighting up. These are the neurons that are connected, and they're sending information from one neuron to the next. You have brain cells that are sending signals. You have your muscular cells, your brain cells sending information to your hands and to your arms. They're sending from your brain cells through the interneurons to other parts and other cells in your body, right? So our perceptions, our thoughts, our actions all depend on the pattern of our neural activity in an elaborate, widely distributed networks, right? And if we have the neural networks are damaged in any way, like we said, multiple sclerosis, that again affects your brain and it affects how your body functions, right? Again, that is how disorders and other psychological disorders occur, right? There's damages or there's sometimes the body is fighting against the neurons in your body and then cause issues in your body as well. Okay. One other key process in integrating of signals is there is what we call a synaptic pruning that occurs and takes place. And at the age of around 2 to 10, that's when you see a lot of the synaptic pruning taking place. At birth, you have very, very few neural connections, and you're developing as you learn and grow. Your neural connections begin to grow, and as you see at the age of 6, you have a very, very vast and very, very dense amount of neural connections, right? But the synaptic pruning it eliminates all the old or the less active synapses, right? And when we talk about these synapses, the synapses is sending information from one neuron to the next. And if you have too many synapses, then the signals aren't sent in an efficient way, right? So in order to create some efficiency in about, in early adolescence and later adolescence, you start to see a lot of the pruning taking place. And by the time the end of late adolescence, I think probably the early 20s, probably in the mid 20s, you start to see a lessening of the synaptic pruning processing taking place. And that's when you get to the point where your brain is kind of pruned, all of the different neural connections that it's going to prune, and your neural connections are pretty much set, right? And so you see that here, it's a little dense, and that could cause a lot of confusion for a 6-year-old, right? That's why they have their attention span is really, really short, right? Because they have a lot of neural connections in their brain, and they can be distracted, right? When you get a little older, it's a little easier to focus because again, um, your synaptic pruning is taking place and is taking place, and your synapses are becoming a little more efficient, and your brain needs that efficiency to be able to function at optimum. Okay, but again, here's an example. It says a 2005 study. It found that teenagers can't multitask as well as adults because their brains are still learning, right? How to process multiple pieces of information at once, the way adults can. Again, part of that is based on the development of the brain and the process of synaptic pruning, right? So you see the synaptic density here at 6, and then again at 14, and then you'll also see it. This will be very, very different than what you see in early adulthood as well. Okay. So what happens during this process? We talk about the neurotransmitters being sent across from a presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron through that synaptic cleft. Those little red dots we saw before, there are specific neurotransmitters at specific kinds of synapses, okay? And so that happens when you have specific neurons, specific cells connected to other specific cells. And again, everything has a purpose, right? And so many of the chemical substances that serve as neurotransmitters, we'll talk about some of the main ones here, but there are at least 100 known neurotransmitters, and there are others that are being discovered. But out of the 100, there are several that are kind of the most common, and we'll talk about a few of them here as we move forward. Okay, so one of the major ones is what we call acetylcholine, and this is is an excitatory neurotransmitter. So when we talk about the excitatory PSP, that is going to increase the likelihood that an acts potential will fire. And we'll talk about how in the next slide, how if there is some type of deficiency in the amount of acetylcholine, then you start to have problems and have certain disorders, right? So again, it's found throughout the nervous system, and again, it only transmits between the motor neurons and muscular cells, right? So it's really, really important for how we move our muscles and everything that's related to motion. Okay, if it's not in good supply, then you start to have issues with Alzheimer's, and then you also have issues with Parkinson's disease, which is an issue with the nervous system, and then your control of your body, control of your muscles becomes abnormal, and the stiffness and shaking, all of that happens when you don't have enough acetylcholine in your system. You have neurotransmitters are also categorized into what we call monoamines, which are 3 neurotransmitters, and there are several more. Epinephrine is another one. You have dopamine, norepinephrine, and then you have serotonin. And all of these function. When we talk, these are also different hormones in our body, but they also serve as neurotransmitters that are passed from one neuron to the next. Okay. You have dopamine, which is the reward drug, and or reward neurotransmitter. Whenever you're sensing something that you get is a rewarding feeling, you have dopamine, right? And that's that dopamine is being released into your system. Serotonin is kind of a mood stabilizer, right? So serotonin in your system really, really helps to maintain your mood. You got GABA, which is I can't pronounce it, but GABA is an amino acid. It's a non-protein amino acid, and it produces only inhibitory postsynaptic potential. So it slows down the firing of action potential. So you have excitatory again, and then you have inhibitory, and it slows down the processing or firing of action potential. And then you have what we call endorphins, which are they're produced and they resemble opiates in the structure and their effects. They can be serve as a kind of a pain reliever when you need, you have maybe you cut your arm, and endorphins are then released to help to reduce that pain in that particular area. Okay, here's just a chart and table that kind of gives you an idea of kind of what the neurotransmitter is, the characteristics and its relationships to behaviors, and then kind of disorders that are associated with any dysregulation. Like I talked about before, acetylcholine. You can also include in here one of the disorders is Parkinson's disease, right? It's released by motor neurons, and it controls any skeletal muscles. So if it does not have, you don't have enough acetylcholine, then you can understand that the controlling of your skeletal muscles would begin to decrease, right? And that's what causes the Parkinson's disease, right? You're unable to control your muscles in an effective way. Alzheimer's disease, it's slowing down your memories, right? So if you don't have enough, your brain activity slows down, and that affects your memory and can create Alzheimer's disease, right? GABA is another one that I've done a little research on, and GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and if you don't have enough inhibitory transmitters, then the activity remains really, really high, and that's what creates anxiety. It creates ADHD. It creates some of those other anxiety disorders, right? And so you want a good level of GABA in your system because it helps to regulate sleep, insomnia. And again, that's one of the reasons why insomnia takes place, because your brain is super active, right? You need some inhibitory postsynaptic neurons to slow down the activity in your body, okay? And again, just like this, resemble opiate drugs or endorphins. They play a role in pain relief, response to stress, and contribute to the regulation of eating behavior. Okay. So as a check, it says, which of the following are the branch-like parts of the neuron that are specialized to receive information? You can pause it here, but if you think back to the structures, you should have gotten the answer of dendrites. Okay. So again, most neurons receive information from many other cells, and again, there is a really extensive dendritic tree, and that dendrite is receiving information from other cells and other neurons. Okay. So let's talk about the nervous system. Okay. And then we'll end on this unit, and we'll pick up on part 2 of the lecture. Okay. So the central nervous system is again made up of, the nervous system itself is made up of 2 distinct parts. You have what we call the central nervous system, and then you have the peripheral nervous system. Okay. The central nervous system is made up of 2 main components, the brain and the spinal cord. The brain, of course, is one of the most important organs of our body. It is the computer. It is the control center of our entire body. And when anything happens to the brain, anything happens to the spinal cord, you're in trouble, right? So you want to protect your brain and protect your spinal cord at all costs. That's why sports are can be extremely dangerous. I was a football player. I've had several concussions, but that's why you wear protective head equipment, right? To protect your brain from any major injury, any traumatic brain injury. And you want to protect that because, again, it is the control center and controls most of everything that we do, right? It controls the way we think, the way we learn, the way we move, the way we feel, and any damage to the brain can affect us in a really negative way. And so we want to make sure that it's protected at all costs. It contains billions of interacting cells that integrate information from inside and outside of the body. So what we experience as humans, the environment, our external stimuli is being processed through our brain. And we'll talk about brain structure in part 2 of this lecture. But again, we have different structures in our brain that are helping to aid us in processing information, integrate information from outside and even inside of our body, involuntarily or voluntarily. Okay. Then you have the spinal cord, which is part of the central nervous system, and it carries information back and forth between the brain and the nerves that run throughout the body. Okay, and again, it's the center, right? It's kind of the I'd call it the core of the body that helps to send information through the peripheral nervous system. Okay? So, like I talked about, the nervous system itself is split into two parts. We talked about the central nervous system, which we have the brain and the spinal cord. And in part two of our lecture, we'll look at the brain and we'll look at the different parts of the brain and what their functions are. But for this particular section, we're going to talk about the peripheral nervous system. The somatic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system. Somatic meaning voluntary, so the autonomic meaning automatic. And so we'll talk about those two and how they work in tandem with one another. Right. So the peripheral nervous system comprises all the nerves that lie outside of the brain and the spinal cord. So you have nerves that come from the brain down through the spinal cord, and then those nerves then radiate out of the spinal cord to your arms, to your legs, out to your toes, everywhere you can think of. Right, there are so many different nerves, and you'll understand that if you have nerve damage, right, I have sciatica. Right, if you have a nerve that's being pinched by, maybe your spinal cord, then you start to get some pain radiated down your leg. Right, those nerves are being pinched. Right, so having pinched nerves is never a fun thing. Right, so you want to make sure again your nerves are in optimal functioning position. Right, so that you're not receiving any pain. Okay, but nerves again are just those bundles of neuron fibers, what we call those axons, that are routed together in the peripheral nervous system, and there are bundles of them that go all over the body. Okay, so the somatic nervous system comprises the nerves that connect voluntary skeletal muscles and to the sensory receptors. Right, so when we touch, when we sense heat, the touch of the face, right? Being able to move, those are voluntary skeletal muscles. We're able to move our face in different ways and wink and all those different things based on the somatic nervous system. And those nerve signals are being sent from our brain to other parts of the brain, other parts of the body, right? You have what we call afferent nerve fibers and efferent nerve fibers. And these are the fibers and the nerves. They're axons that carry information inward, and then you have axons that carry information outward. Afferent are those axons that carry information inward from the outside world, from the periphery into the brain. And then you have the efferent, which carries information from the brain out to the periphery of the body. Right. So if I'm sending, I want to pick up this water bottle. Me picking up this water bottle was me, my brain sending my signal. Have vision. I see the bottle. I'm able to pick it up because again, I'm sending information outward from the central nervous system to the periphery of the body. That is the afferent nerve fibers functioning. Right. Again, when you feel something warm, you touch it, and that information is coming in to the nervous system to tell you what you're touching, what it feels like, all those different information that comes in. Okay. But again, each body contains each of these types of axons. And again, it's a two-way street, sends information out and sends information in from the outside and inside of the body. Okay. The other piece of the peripheral nervous system is the autonomic nervous system. Okay. And it comprises the nerves that connect to the heart, blood vessels, smooth muscles, glands, and it regulates all those internal organs of our body, the digestion, the heartbeat, perspiration, all of those things that occur outside of our control. If it's really warm, we start to sweat instantly because again, it's an automatic system, right? That perspiration happens automatically. If you're frightened, your heart rate goes up and you respond in that way because of your autonomic nervous system. It's called what we call an involuntary nervous system because it happens automatically whether we like it or not. Okay. You have what we call a sympathetic division of the nervous system, and you have a parasympathetic division of the nervous system. The sympathetic division of the nervous system, it increases your energy in your body and prepares you for an emergency. Right. So it mobilizes all your body's resources. Say that maybe you're about to be attacked by a dog. Right. You see a dog growling at you. Your body begins to get into fight or flight mode, right? Your body is increasing the resources in your body, is preparing your body to either fight the dog or run away from the dog, right? Now, many of us are going to go ahead and run, but our body is responding to allow us to do that. So the adrenaline in our body is pumping. If you ever heard, women getting the strength of 2 or 3 men to lift something off of their child that's being crushed by something, the adrenaline is being pumping, their sympathetic division is being heightened, and their energy in their body is being increased to the level where they're able to lift, you know, lift so much heavier than what they normally would if they were in a normal state, right? So we have to be mindful of that. That's how that works. And then you have the parasympathetic division, right? So the sympathetic division is when your body is increasing the energy in your body, you're preparing for battle. And then the parasympathetic is the conserving information. I'm resting. I'm coming down from that really, really intense moment. Maybe I had an argument with my fiance and I'm really, really up, sympathetic division. And then after we get done arguing or having a discussion, then my body begins to come down, and that's the sympathetic division operating and functioning, and I'm able to conserve bodily resources, right? Again, the autonomic nervous system, again, it mediates all of the physiological arousal that we experience when we experience emotions. I'm really, really happy. Again, that sympathetic division starts to increase, and then when I get back down, then I have the parasympathetic division that's operating to bring me back down. Okay. Autonomic nervous system, again, you have the parasympathetic on the left and the sympathetic division on the right, and each of them is responsible for fight or flight, or rest and digestion response. And again, depending on where you are, sympathetic raises your energy up and increases the energy, and then when you're getting back down, then your parasympathetic is operating. And these are some of the things that happen with your body that, again, happen automatically. When you're really, really, really excited, your pupils are dilated. And when the parasympathetic division turns on, then it's constricted. Your heart rate goes up, respiration, breathing increases, perspiration, so your sweat glands begin to increase, perspiration, hair follicles begin to rise, goosebumps, your bladder is relaxed, so you're ready to, again, you're ready to roll, you're ready to go. And the parasympathetic, all the opposite happens, right? You decrease respiration, so you're breathing. You take a deep breath and you start to slow down. Digestion is stimulated, and all those things happen. Okay, so it says, which of the following is made up of nerves that connect the voluntary skeletal muscles and sensory receptors that carry information from the central nervous system to the muscle? Right? You want to be able to, again, know this. We know that, again, we talked about it in class, process of elimination. I know that C and D are not going to be the answer. So again, now I'm looking at keywords, right? I have voluntary skeletal muscles, sensory receptors, right? So now I know that it would have to be A, excuse me. The somatic nervous system, again, nerves that connect voluntary skeletal muscles and to other sensory receptors. Okay. So we'll stop there and we'll pick up at the brain and behavior, and we'll finish up chapter 3 in part 2 for biological basis of behavior.